Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes, and today we will dive into the updates on the Russia-Ukraine war with potential truce talks to take place between the Russian and US President. Russian President Vladimir Putin states that he is open to meetings with US President Donald Trump to discuss issues such as energy prices and the ongoing war in Ukraine. He praised Trump, calling him smart and pragmatic, and suggested that had Trump won the 2020 election, the conflict in Ukraine might not have escalated. Putin's comments on the 2020 US election, which he referred to as stolen, were seen as a gesture of flattery towards Trump. Ukraine insists that any peace deal must secure terms favourable to Kyiv, particularly regarding the territories occupied by Russia. Ukrainian officials have criticised Putin's focus on negotiating with the US about the fate of Europe and Ukraine without involving Ukraine in the discussions. Putin's peace demands include the lifting of sanctions, Ukraine's withdrawal from occupied territories, and the abandonment of its NATO aspirations. Despite ongoing economic challenges, experts suggest that Russia is capable of continuing the war for another year. There are reports that the Kremlin may be open to negotiations, but could prolong talks to adjust its terms for peace. Hardline figures close to Putin, such as Konstantin Malifev, has emphasised the need for Ukraine's complete capitulation. Meanwhile, Trump has not presented a detailed plan for ending the war, but has suggested a demilitarised zone along the border. Joining us for this discussion, we have Daniel Wagner, the CEO of Country Risk Solutions, who's joining us from Portland, Oregon. We have Arvind Mahajan, Lamar, Savings Professor of Finance at Texas A&M University at the College Station in Texas. We have Ambassador Suresh Goel, a former diplomat who's joining us from Noida. And we have Ingrid Kim, a Russian journalist from Moscow. Starting off, if I can, please, with yourself, Arvind Mahajan. We're looking here at a situation where the rhetoric between Trump and between Putin seems to be swaying from day to day. Trump threatens oil tariffs and sanctions. Then Putin turns around and starts flattering, seemingly, the US president. What do you think is the sort of goal of either party in these public displays of either sort of affirmation or seeming disdain, really?
I think they are both posturing. I think they are both trying to get some sense of where each one is coming from. I think they are trying to establish their negotiating boundaries. And in some ways, most of us really do not know what exactly to expect, because the policies have been quite fluid. There's been rhetoric on one hand, but the action sometimes does not match the rhetoric. So in some ways, everyone is just waiting for how things will evolve. And I think that is the case with both President Trump and President Putin as well.
Daniel Wagner, looking at the announcement that we've had that foreign aid funding will be frozen in the meantime from the United States to all but two nations, not including Ukraine, do you think this could have an impact, or is the Biden administration's final aid packages, do you think that's going to continue the aid going for the foreseeable and not have much of an impact on the war?
Well, first of all, the executive order basically said to halt all foreign aid for 90 days. It's not just new aid that was supposed to go out. So the Trump administration wants to evaluate the existing aid programs and decide what they want to support and then prioritize them. My concern, apart from cutting people off, and that's going to hurt a lot of people in a lot of ways, including American aid workers who probably won't get paid. But my concern is that this becomes a quid pro quo. Trump will turn foreign aid into what can I get from you in return from what I give to you. And that's not the way foreign aid is generally supposed to work. I'm very curious to see many countries' reaction. And I'm also very concerned that a lot of countries are ultimately going to turn to countries like China and say, hey, can you fill the void here? That has already been done. That's an existing dynamic in the international arena. In terms of Ukraine, well, there doesn't seem to be much doubt that if aid continues from America to Ukraine, it will be a fraction or a trickle. And Europe will have to step up and make up the difference if there is going to be the difference made up. But it comes at a critical time because, of course, Ukraine is already perceived to be losing the war. It's perceived to be weaker than it was in previous forms of engagement during the war. And, I'm not sure what this means for Putin in terms of his incentive to actually deal with America at this juncture. Think of it this way. You've got two bullies in a schoolyard, and one bully threatens the other. Is the other bully likely to back down? I think not. I'm concerned that this could entirely backfire, this entire approach that Trump is using on Ukraine and other countries, and maybe even blow up in America's face in some instances.
Ambassador Suresh Goel, President Zelensky has said that Putin is trying to manipulate Donald Trump. Do you think that's the case?
I think there are different signals here. And the way I see the situation now changing is that President Trump thinks that the financial outflows from the US, whether into Ukraine or to some other countries, they can influence the decision making in those countries to the extent that the USA likes. Now, I think over the last several decades, not just few years, we have seen the limitation of this approach. Many countries have been able to question and challenge the sanctions and the financial inflows, the aid or whatever you want to call it, from the USA during both the regimes, the Republicans as well as Democrats, and they have been able to really continue through their own geopolitics with getting affected, but without that really changing their political decision making. Having said that, what I really do think is that President Trump is playing a very dangerous game. And the danger here really is that when both Ukraine and Russia find out the limitations of the American approach, Russia is already quite close to China, we know that. Whether Ukraine also will not really veer toward China and look at China really as a mediating role or playing a role in terms of getting the two countries to resolve their issues. And in the process, the USA will lose even the slight leverage they have in the whole game. So what I find really here is that for some reason, Trump is not able to understand the limitations of his approach. And this could actually lead the whole world to really give a greater role to China in global geopolitics. That's a huge problem.
Arvind Mahajan, Putin has, despite his compliments towards Trump, also hit back at Trump's claims that lower fuel prices could end the war, negatively impacting the Russian economy. For Vladimir Putin, do you think that he believes in those claims? And do you think that he sees himself in a position of power, whether those fuel restrictions come in or not?
Well, I think he does, as a matter of fact. A couple of things. One, tariffs as a generality don't work. Sanctions as a generality don't work. There are too many leakages in the system. And we have seen over the last couple of years that whatever the West, Europe, and the United States has tried to do, the war has continued. And the war has continued in the favor of Russia, it seems, from the distance here. I understand why people are concerned about Trump's approach not working, but the fact of the matter is that with the previous administration, we really had a stalemate. I mean, significant amount of resources were deployed in Ukraine, but really we were going nowhere. So in some ways, I think Trump's is a new experiment, is shaking things up, and let's see where they land. It really is unclear to me how things will work out, but at least from my viewpoint, there is an opportunity of finding a new equilibrium. Because the previous equilibrium, we were really not going anywhere. A lot of resources were being deployed, but it was a stalemate. And now I think, I think it's a very legitimate concern that Russia, as well as perhaps Ukraine, I don't think the latter, but Russia clearly is getting closer to China, which is not something in the interest of the United States as well as Europe as well. I think that's a very legitimate concern, but in some ways there are not that many alternatives in front of the United States other than to try a new approach. And Trump really, because he is unorthodox and somewhat unpredictable, is, I think, the right character to attempt shaking this tree up in a different way than it has been before.
Daniel Wagner, looking at the alliance there with Putin and China, if Trump withdraws funding and, like President Vladimir Zelensky says, Russia are able to continue their advance at a bigger rate, does Trump risk strengthening Russia and potentially down the line, if there were to be any, maybe not direct conflict, but at least conflict between the two nations geopolitically? Do you think Trump's withdrawal of funding and freeze on funding could have a negative impact on the US down the line?
Yeah, I certainly think that's possible. Let's bear in mind that the bilateral relationship between Russia and China is, shall we say, a marriage of convenience? Traditionally, these two countries have actually been enemies throughout history, and they have gotten together when it's been in their interest to do so. That is the case now. But China's very leery about Russia, its war in Ukraine, and its future together. Clearly, they have a strong commercial relationship. But let's not forget, they also share a major border that's thousands of kilometers long. So for China, security is always a preeminent issue. And with Russia having proven that it is itself highly unpredictable under Putin in terms of what it will do in the global arena, China's sort of wondering, well, can we really trust them? How long will this marriage of convenience last? But I do think that once aid does stop or dwindle significantly from Ukraine, initially that's likely to strengthen that bilateral relationship because they'll see an opportunity to do something significant together that is against the West, which is, of course, one of their primary objectives. So let's stay tuned on that. I think the marriage of convenience will not last forever. I'm very leery about its underpinnings. And I think as long as they've got a neighborhood bully in Trump who is rattling the cage for both of them, they are incentivized to keep that marriage going.
Yes, Ambassador Suresh Goel. Looking at the Western alliances as they are, do you think that Trump is going to need to lean on the EU to make sure they up their support if he wants to continue seeing a Ukrainian, at least holding of Russian forces, if it's not in his personal interest to see Russia take more of Ukraine?
You mentioned EU. Now, if you look at the kind of leverages that Trump, and I'm mentioning Trump, because I think all said and done, before him, Biden, there were limitations, but he did not look at EU as a kind of a bargaining chip or playing poker with it, really. If you want to look at EU that you're playing poker with it, what are the kind of leverages you have? What are the kind of cards you are playing with? I really wonder, because so far I've not seen that American, with the kind of cost of production, the economy the way it is, they have any kind of leverages with the European Union or with China or with India. Yes, I agree that we still need technology from USA, and therefore we must listen to it. But otherwise, Americans are losing, the USA are losing their leverage slowly. And therefore we need to look at it in a different matrix. And that matrix, I would assume that if we look at the global situation, who are the biggest allies for the USA? And the biggest allies for the USA are in Europe, not in Indo-Pacific, not China, not Southeast Asia, not South Asia. India will be a balancing country, balancing power in Indo-Pacific, but that's about it really as far as Trump is concerned. And Trump has already indicated his weakness by saying that the tariffs against China don't need to be increased. So I think at the most what we are seeing from Washington is uncertainty. I would say it's a weakness. I would say that it's actually the uncertainty of the whole system of how to deal with the global situation. And therefore, I said right in the beginning, let us wait and see how it pans out. I'm not so sure about the whole situation right at the moment.
Arvind Mahajan, while we wait and see what will come from potential peace talks, what we do know is fighting is continuing on the front line, and a nation directly involved in that fighting is North Korea. Do you think an alliance between Russia, North Korea and potentially China would be against Donald Trump's wishes, though he has made positive comments about Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, of course. I think any collaboration between these three countries is not in the best interest of the United States because their objectives conflict with the interests of the United States. I will point out one thing which was earlier mentioned about the marriage of convenience between the Russians and the Chinese. And as a matter of fact, in geopolitics, virtually all relationships, all marriages are out of convenience. The one which was not was the US-European relationship, especially after the Second World War. It was not necessarily perceived as a transactional relationship. And one thing which Trump coming on the scene has made that relationship transactional as well, which from my viewpoint is somewhat unfortunate because US could depend upon Europe on many dimensions, as could Europe on the United States. And I think cracks have come in that relationship, which I think will need to be mended somewhere along the line. Because the concern really is, from a larger scheme of things, if indeed US abandons Europe, in some ways, Europe will be forced to gravitate towards China as well. So in some ways, this is a very diabolical situation which exists. But again, it's unclear what the contours of President Bush's policies really are. The objective really is unclear. There's too much rhetoric, but it remains to be seen what actions will be taken in the context of US policy and how Russia responds to it.
We are now joined by Ingrid Kim, who's joining us from Moscow. Ingrid, I really want to get an understanding of the perception of this dialogue between Putin and Trump from within Russia. Can you explain how the sort of perceived flip-flopping between Trump potentially imposing sanctions, but then also speaking positively of talks with Putin and Putin in return doing the same?
Yes, I think it will be more positive dialogue because we see from our side positive influence from Trump's presidency as he now more imposing his, let's say, threats either on European lands, as he wants to claim from Danish island, what I heard in news. So he not only potentially showing he's going to impose for Russian sanctions. I think it will be a step back as a way of revoke that sanctions, which was imposed by Biden. I believe in positive way of solution because he throws this aid, which is supposed to be goes to Ukraine, and now we see how he is more serious with migrants in his country. He concentrated more in internal politics of his country, which is more right way to be president in your country. For me, it's more better president in this time. We are happy that he won these elections. And I think as my president, Vladimir Putin said, he's going to talk to him very, let's say, adequate way when before it was not possible with Biden. So we will see how it will be developed in the way of positively for economics between all international countries' trade. And also what was mentioned previous speaker about China influence, yes, I agree that of course this time for China is more beneficial position to, let's say, to show his rules, either rules to US or Russia, because China is a big player in this game.
Ingrid, staying with you, US funding to Ukraine has been frozen. Do you think now is the time that Putin wants to sign a deal, considering his opposition on the battlefield might be the weakest they've been since the start of the war?
I can't, let's say, estimate my president's action, I feel we will go our agenda, which we started from 2022 in February. Our position is to hold our borders from any enemy who want to invade into our country. For us, we always get attacks from Ukrainian side. Always bombing and missiles, drones from Ukrainian side goes to our land, for our bordering cities, Belgrade, Kursk, in south, let's say, region, which is spread and get, let's say, injured, people died, killed also. This is not mentioned in their West news, which is supposed to be mentioned too, how many numbers killed, and also our soldiers. I feel Vladimir Putin called our year is a year of.
While we get that connection fixed there, Daniel Wagner, I just want to pick up on a point that was made there by Ingrid, and particularly the question that I posed in terms of Putin's mindset going into any potential negotiations. It's difficult to know, of course, what he's thinking, but what do you think the ideal situation for Vladimir Putin would be in any deal that was made with Ukraine?
First of all, I don't think that if I were Vladimir Putin, I'd be very anxious to start negotiating right now. As has been pointed out, he's in a comparatively favorable position. Ukraine is weaker than it's been in quite some time, and the stalemate continues, and the funding for Ukraine could be, ended permanently. I think Putin ultimately is going to wait. I think he's going to see if the Europeans step up to the plate and replace some of that funding. I think he's going to see what additional victories they might have during this war in the course of the coming weeks or even months. And I really don't see how he's incentivized to start talking with Trump seriously. I would add that Trump's lever, as he's using with all countries around the world right now, is tariffs and the trade relationship that it has with each of these countries. In the case of Russia, Russia exports only 3% of its exports to the United States, worth about $15 billion last year. So I don't think that lever is likely to work. If Trump wants to incentivize Putin, he's going to have to do something else.
Arvind Mahajan. Looking at the relationship between Donald Trump and President Zelensky, it almost feels that the conversations regarding Trump and Putin have taken over. But do you think that Trump has an important role to play in discussions with Ukraine, considering the action he's taken regarding funding?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think President Trump certainly can impress upon Ukraine to get onto the negotiating table. Right now, in some ways, Ukraine has been stuck in its entrenched rhetoric of getting its territory back before it stops participating in the conflict. And I think in some ways, President Trump is going to impress upon him that outcome is very unlikely. And in that sense, I think President Trump can provide some reality check to President Zelensky in as far as what the outcome may end up being. Clearly, the European Union and most people in the United States would like the territory of Ukraine to be returned back, make them whole. I think everyone stopped talking about Crimea. Now it's just 20% landmass of Ukraine, which Russia has. And I think in some ways, President Trump can take a position of forcing Ukraine to get on the table and come to some kind of a resolution. I just don't see this war sustaining itself. It's doing everyone a lot of harm. And there's only one person at this point who can grab both these parties and say, settle down. So I think, yes, President Trump can influence President Zelensky to get to the negotiating table.
Ambassador Goel, to finish off, of course, Donald Trump's rhetoric before being sworn in and inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States was that the war would be finished on the first day. If Putin does delay, as mentioned previously, what does that say about Trump's ability to get the job done?
You see, the US of A I think it's the only country at the moment in the world which has the capacity to influence the world events to the extent that if you want to coerce both Ukraine and the Russian Federation to come to a stop in the war, they can do so. And that is simply because not of the financial inflows or tariffs or anything else at all. But the fact is that the Americans, the USA is the largest military power at the moment with huge capacity to be able to enforce its will. And USA through NATO and through other such institutional linkages is also the security provider globally in many countries. And therefore, if they were to make the message clear that the guys stop and this is what you need to do, with some negotiations, it can be brought to a stop really. But the problem is, to my mind, that you cannot actually mix up politics with economics to that extent. And Trump is doing it. And when you begin to do it, you send mixed messages which don't work. In the case of Europe, I do hope that Trump is able to tell both Ukraine and Russia categorically that what you are doing is changing the world beyond our imagination, and it is going to a point from where I don't think we want to go there. I mentioned China before, and the fact is that if China brings their own system to the international order, everybody is in a problem. And I think if Trump can really work that way, things will happen, but Trump doesn't know what he wants.
Ambassador Goel, thank you very much. We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you, Arvind Mahajan. Also, thank you to Daniel Wagner. And thank you very much, Ingrida Kim. We will, of course, continue to bring you the updates between Russia and Ukraine and also Trump's impact over the next weeks or potentially months here on NewsX.